Say it again, louder, so everyone can hear what you think I am. The words didn't come from anger. They came from control. And that was what made the entire room go still. The clinking of silverware softened into a distant echo, like it had been pushed behind glass. A jazz piano played somewhere near the bar, slow and polished, but even that felt out of place now, like music playing at the wrong time in a movie. Naomi Carter stood beside table 12, her tray balanced steadily in one hand, her posture straight, her eyes calm. Across from her, Brian Collins let out a short, disbelieving laugh, the kind that wasn't really laughter but something sharper, something meant to cut. He adjusted his cufflinks, glancing briefly at the surrounding tables, noticing the way a few heads had already turned, the way a couple of phones were beginning to tilt upward just slightly. He didn't lower his voice. He raised it. "I said you clearly don't belong here," he replied, each word spaced just enough to land. "This isn't a place for mistakes." The sentence hung in the air, heavy, deliberate. Naomi didn't move. Not a flinch, not a step back. Just a slow breath in, then out. The overhead lighting cast a soft amber glow across the polished floor, reflecting in fragments beneath her shoes. Around them, guests shifted in their seats. Some looked away, pretending not to notice. Others leaned in, curiosity quietly replacing comfort. Because moments like this didn't happen out loud. Not usually. Not like this. Earlier that evening, Naomi had been invisible, just another server moving between tables, refilling glasses, clearing plates, her presence acknowledged only when something was needed. That was the unspoken rule of places like this. Be perfect, but not too noticeable. Efficient, but not memorable. And Naomi had mastered that balance. Years of it. Long shifts, double shifts, early mornings that started before sunrise and nights that stretched past midnight. She knew how to read a room, how to anticipate requests before they were spoken, how to carry herself in a way that made everything look effortless. But tonight, something had shifted. Not in the room. In her. Brian took a step. Closer, his voice lowering just enough to sound controlled, but still loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "You cost us a client tonight," he said. "Do you even understand that?" Naomi's grip on the tray remained steady. "I followed your instructions exactly," she replied, her voice even, measured, almost quiet enough to miss if you weren't listening for it. That was the difference. Brian spoke to be heard. Naomi spoke to be understood. A pause followed, brief but sharp. The kind of silence that stretches just long enough to make people uncomfortable. Somewhere behind them, a glass was set down a little too quickly. A chair shifted. The room wasn't loud anymore. It was watching. Brian's jaw tightened, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it. Calm, certain, not defensive. And that, more than anything, felt like defiance. He opened his mouth again, ready to push further, to reassert control, to remind everyone exactly who was in charge. But before he could speak, something changed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. The front doors of the restaurant opened with a quiet mechanical glide, letting in a brief wash of cooler air from outside. No one announced it. No one needed to. Because the energy shifted instantly, like a current running through the room. A few heads turned first, then more. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Even Brian hesitated, just for a second, his attention pulled toward the entrance without fully understanding why. And Naomi, still standing exactly where she was, felt it too. Not fear, not relief, just a shift. Like the moment before something changes, even if you don't yet know how. The man who stepped inside didn't rush. He didn't need to. His presence moved ahead of him, quiet but unmistakable, as if the room itself recognized him before anyone said his name. And just like that, the balance of power, the one Brian thought he controlled, began to tilt. The man did not announce himself, but he did not need to. His presence carried a quiet authority that moved through the room faster than any introduction could. Conversations that had not yet stopped now faded completely, as if the air itself had decided to listen. Alexander Hayes stepped forward with measured ease, his shoes barely making a sound against the polished floor, his gaze steady, observant, taking in everything without appearing to look too closely at anything. He wore no expression that demanded attention, yet attention followed him anyway. Not because he asked for it, but because people like him never had to. Naomi noticed it first in the way the staff straightened, Almost instinctively, the way the host near the entrance suddenly adjusted his posture, the way even Brian's shoulders shifted just slightly, as if some invisible weight had pressed down on them. Brian cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the moment, but the rhythm had already been broken. "Sir, welcome," he said quickly, stepping forward with a smile that came too fast to be genuine. "We were just handling a small issue with one of the staff." The word issue lingered, thin and deliberate, like it was meant to shrink Naomi back into something manageable, something easy to dismiss. Alexander did not respond immediately. Instead, he let the silence stretch, just long enough for the discomfort to return, just long enough for Brian's confidence to begin unraveling at the edges. His eyes moved past Brian, not abruptly, not dismissively, but with intention, settling on Naomi for a brief moment that felt longer than it should have. There was no judgment in that look, no assumption, just recognition. Then, calmly, he spoke. "I heard enough from the door," he said, his voice even, controlled, carrying without needing to rise. The words were simple, but they landed with weight. Brian's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Of course," he replied quickly. "It is nothing serious. Just a misunderstanding." A misunderstanding. The phrase hung in the air, familiar, convenient, used to smooth over moments that were never truly smooth. Naomi did not move, but something inside her sharpened. She had heard that word before. Many times. It always meant the same thing. Let it go. Alexander took one more step forward, closing the distance just enough to stand within the circle of tension that had formed around them. He glanced briefly at the nearby tables, at the guests who were no longer pretending not to watch, at the phones that had not yet been lowered. Then his attention returned to Brian. "Then you will not mind clarifying it," he said. "Not a question, a statement." Brian hesitated. Only for a moment, but it was enough. Because hesitation, in a room like this, spoke louder than any explanation. Naomi felt it too. That shift again. Subtle, but undeniable. Brian straightened, his tone tightening just slightly as he spoke. "She failed to follow protocol with a client," he said, gesturing toward Naomi without fully looking at her. "I was addressing it." Addressing it. Another word that sounded cleaner than the moment it described. Alexander's gaze did not leave Brian. "And how did you address it?" he asked. The question was precise, almost quiet, but it carried a clarity that left no room to hide behind language. Brian opened his mouth, then paused, his mind searching for the version of the story that would hold under scrutiny. Around them, the room remained still, suspended in that same fragile silence, waiting. Naomi did not speak. She did not need to, because for the first time that night, the truth was not something she had to defend. It was something that was about to be revealed. And as Alexander Hayes stood there, calm, unshaken, watching without interruption, it became clear to everyone in the room that this was no longer a moment that could be controlled, reshaped, or dismissed. This was a moment that would be seen. Brian's silence lasted just a second too long, and in a room built on confidence, that was all it took for doubt to begin spreading. He shifted his weight slightly, forcing a small smile as if he could still guide the narrative back into something safe, something controlled. "It was a service error," he said, his voice tighter now, more careful. "A simple matter of professionalism." The word professionalism echoed faintly, as if even it was not fully convinced. Alexander did not react immediately. He did not interrupt. He simply turned his head, just enough, and looked directly at Naomi again. Not past her, not through her, at her. "Is that accurate?" he asked. The question was gentle, but it carried a gravity that made the room lean in without moving. Naomi felt every eye shift toward her, felt the weight of expectation settle across her shoulders, but she did not shrink under it. She had spent years being unseen. Tonight, being seen did not scare her. "No, sir," she replied, her voice steady, clear, unhurried. She did not raise it. She did not rush to fill the silence. She let the truth sit exactly where it needed to. Another pause followed, thicker this time, heavier. Somewhere near the back of the room, someone exhaled softly, like they had been holding their breath without realizing it. Alexander's gaze remained on Naomi for a moment longer, measuring not just her words, but the way she carried them. Then he turned back to Brian. "Then explain it again," he said calmly. This time, there was no room left for interpretation. Brian's expression tightened, the edges of his confidence now clearly fraying. He glanced briefly at the surrounding tables, at the subtle glow of phone screens, at the quiet attention that had settled over the entire room. The version of events he had prepared in his mind no longer felt stable. It felt exposed. "She delayed a client order," he said, choosing his words more carefully now, each one placed like it might be questioned, and refused to correct it when instructed. Naomi did not interrupt. She did not react. But inside, she remembered the moment clearly. The client had changed his order twice, each time contradicting the previous request, each time speaking over her before she could confirm. Brian had stepped in halfway through, impatient, dismissive, instructing her to just fix it without listening to what had actually happened. And when the final plate reached the table, it reflected exactly what had been last demanded. Not what had been originally ordered, not what Brian later claimed, but what the client himself had insisted on. "That is not what happened," Naomi said quietly. Not defensive, not emotional, just precise. Brian's jaw tightened again, this time more visibly. "You are mistaken," he replied quickly. "I was there." The statement was firm, but it lacked something it had earlier. Certainty. Alexander's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus. "So was she," he said, nodding toward Naomi. The balance shifted again, just a fraction, but enough to feel. It was no longer one voice against another. It was credibility being weighed in real time. Alexander took a slow breath, then spoke again, his tone unchanged, still calm, still measured. "Let us remove interpretation," he said. "Who placed the final instruction for the order?" The question cut cleanly through the noise of assumptions and hierarchy. Brian hesitated. Again. And this time, the hesitation was louder. Naomi answered without delay. "The client did," she said. Simple. Direct. True. Alexander held that answer for a moment, letting it settle, letting the room absorb it. Then he turned back to Brian, not raising his voice, not changing his posture, but shifting something far more powerful. Expectation. "Then your issue is not with her performance," he said. "It is with your own process." The words landed without force, but they carried weight that could not be ignored. Around them, the silence deepened, no longer uncertain, but aware. Because what had started as a correction was becoming something else entirely. Not a misunderstanding, not a small issue, but a moment where truth, once given space, began to rearrange everything. Brian did not respond right away, and that silence told the room more than any explanation ever could. It was no longer the silence of control, the kind he had used minutes earlier to dominate the space. This was a different kind of silence, one that exposed hesitation, one that revealed cracks. He shifted again, this time more noticeably, his fingers adjusting his sleeve as if he could smooth out the tension that had already settled into the fabric of the moment. "That is not what I meant," he said finally, his voice lower now, less certain, trying to reclaim ground that was already slipping. But the words felt thinner than before, like they had lost their weight the second they were spoken. Alexander did not interrupt him, but he did not nod either. He simply watched, allowing Brian to continue if he chose to, allowing him the space to either clarify or unravel further. Around them, the room remained still, but it was no longer passive. It was aware. Guests who had once been focused on their meals now leaned slightly forward, their attention no longer hidden. Staff members stood straighter, quieter, sensing that something important was unfolding, something that would not be easily forgotten once it ended. Naomi remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her expression composed, but inside, something subtle had shifted. Not relief, not yet, but recognition. For once, the moment was not moving against her. It was balancing. Brian let out a short breath, as if preparing to speak again, but this time, Alexander stepped forward just enough to close the distance between them, not aggressively, not forcefully, but with a quiet precision that made the movement impossible to ignore. "You addressed her in front of guests," Alexander said, his tone still calm, still controlled, but now carrying a sharper clarity. "You questioned her competence without verifying the facts, and you chose to do it publicly." Each statement was measured, deliberate, laid out one after another like pieces of a structure that could not be taken apart once completed. Brian opened his mouth, but no words came immediately, because this time, there was nothing left to reframe. No angle that would soften what had already been seen. Naomi felt the weight of those words settle into the room, felt the way they changed how everyone was looking now, not just at Brian, but at her. Not as background, not as staff, but as someone whose experience had just been acknowledged out loud. And that acknowledgement carried power. Alexander's gaze shifted briefly toward the surrounding tables, toward the quiet witnesses who had become part of this moment simply by being present. Then back to Brian. Leadership is not volume, he continued. It is responsibility. The sentence was simple, but it carried something deeper than correction. It carried expectation. Brian's shoulders lowered slightly, not in defeat, but in something close to it. The confidence that had once filled his voice was no longer there. In its place was something far less certain. I was trying to maintain standards, he said, though the words sounded more like justification than belief. Alexander nodded once, slowly, acknowledging the statement without accepting it fully. Standards apply to everyone, he replied, including you. Another pause followed, but this one felt different. Not tense, not uncertain, clear, defined, because the direction of the moment had been decided. Naomi stood quietly, her hands steady, her breath even, but inside, she felt something she had not expected. Not triumph, not satisfaction, something quieter, something stronger. She had not raised her voice. She had not fought back. And yet, the truth had spoken louder than anything she could have said. And as the room remained still, holding on to that clarity, it became undeniable that this was no longer about a single mistake or a single moment. It was about something deeper, something that could not be dismissed once it had been seen. Brian swallowed slowly, the movement small but visible, like someone trying to regain control of something that had already slipped beyond reach. The weight of the room had changed, and he could feel it pressing in from every direction, not loud, not aggressive, but undeniable. He glanced again at the surrounding tables, at the quiet attention, at the subtle glow of phones still raised just enough to capture without drawing notice, and for the first time that night, he understood that this moment was no longer his to manage. It was his to answer for. I understand, he said, though the words came out thinner than intended, lacking the certainty he had relied on before. Alexander did not respond immediately. He let the statement sit there, unchallenged, unvalidated, allowing its emptiness to reveal itself without force. Then, with the same calm precision he had carried since entering the room, he spoke again. Understanding is not the same as accountability, he said. The sentence landed softly, but it carried a finality that settled into the room like a closing door. Naomi felt it too. That quiet shift from tension to resolution, from uncertainty to direction. But she did not move, did not react outwardly. She had learned long ago that moments like this were not about reaction. They were about presence. Brian nodded quickly, almost reflexively, as if agreement alone could restore what had been lost. Of course, he said. I take full responsibility. But even as he spoke, something in his tone suggested he was still searching for a way to contain the situation, to minimize its impact, to frame it as something smaller than it had become. Alexander's gaze remained steady. Then demonstrate it, he replied. There was no sharpness in his voice, no raised tone, but there was clarity, expectation, a line drawn without being announced. Brian hesitated again, and this time the hesitation stretched longer, more visible, more uncomfortable. Because demonstration required action, and action, in front of an audience like this, carried consequences. Naomi stood quietly, her breathing even, her eyes forward, but inside, she felt something steadying. Not because of what was being said, but because of what was no longer being denied. The truth had been acknowledged, and that alone had shifted the ground beneath everything else. Around them, the room held its stillness, but it was no longer tense. It was attentive, aware that something decisive was about to happen. Brian finally turned toward Naomi, his posture stiff, his expression caught somewhere between formality and discomfort. For a brief moment, he looked like he might speak quickly, rush through it, reduce it to a formality. But then he stopped himself, the weight of Alexander's presence still there, quiet but unmistakable. Naomi, he began, his voice slower now, more deliberate. I misjudged the situation. The words were simple, but they were different from anything he had said before. Not defensive, not dismissive, just stated. Naomi met his gaze, not with challenge, not with triumph, but with calm. She did not nod. She did not respond. She simply listened, because she understood something Brian was only beginning to realize. Words, in moments like this, were not enough on their own. Brian took a small breath, then continued. And I addressed it in a way that was not appropriate. The admission hung there, quiet, but clear. Hey. Few guests shifted slightly, as if the release of tension allowed movement to return to their bodies. Alexander watched without interruption, allowing the moment to unfold on its own terms. Naomi remained steady, her posture unchanged, but inside, she felt the shift complete itself. Not because of the apology itself, but because of what it represented. Recognition, accountability, and something even more important, respect, given not because it was convenient, but because it was required. And in that moment, without raising her voice, without stepping out of her place, she had reclaimed something that had never truly been lost, only overlooked. Her dignity. The apology did not echo. It settled, quietly, firmly, like something that had finally found the place it belonged. And for a brief moment, no one moved. Not the guests, not the staff, not even Brian, who now stood with his shoulders slightly lowered, as if the weight he had been carrying all night had shifted into something he could no longer ignore. Naomi remained still, her eyes steady, her breathing even, but inside, she felt the difference. Not because she had been defended, not because someone powerful had spoken on her behalf, but because the truth had been allowed to stand on its own. And that changed everything. Alexander watched the exchange without interruption, his expression unchanged, but his presence still shaping the moment in ways that did not need to be spoken. He took a slow step back, just enough to widen the space between himself and Brian, signaling without words that the focus was no longer on correction, but on what came next. Because moments like this did not end with acknowledgement. They revealed what people chose to do after. Brian exhaled quietly, glancing once more at Naomi, then at the surrounding room. The attention was still there, but it had softened, no longer sharp or expectant, but observant, waiting to see how this would resolve. You may return to your section, Brian said, his tone now controlled, but different, stripped of the edge it carried before. The words were simple, routine, but they held something new. Restraint. Naomi gave a small nod, not out of submission, but acknowledgement. She turned slightly, her movements smooth, composed, as if the last few minutes had not shaken her, as if she had always belonged exactly where she stood. And in that moment, it was clear that she did. As she stepped away, the room began to breathe again. Conversations returned in low murmurs, silverware resumed its quiet rhythm, and the music, once distant, found its place again in the background. But something had changed, not in the structure of the restaurant, not in the layout of tables or the glow of the lights. Something deeper, something less visible, but far more lasting. Alexander remained where he was for a moment longer, his gaze following Naomi briefly as she moved back into her work, then shifting once more to Brian. One moment, he said, his voice calm, but carrying just enough to pause Brian before he could step away. Brian turned back quickly, his posture straightening again, though not with the same confidence as before. Yes, sir, he replied. Alexander studied him for a second, not with judgment, but with clarity. Accountability is not a performance, he said. It is a pattern. The words were quiet, but they carried a weight that extended beyond the moment, beyond the room, beyond what had just happened. Brian nodded slowly, this time not out of reflex, but understanding. Real or emerging, it was there. Understood, he said. Alexander held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a single, almost imperceptible nod before turning away. No announcement. No further correction. Just a shift of attention, as if the lesson had already been delivered and did not need repetition. Across the room, Naomi reached for a glass at another table, her hands steady, her movements precise, her focus unchanged. To anyone who had not witnessed the moment, she looked like she always had. Professional, quiet, efficient. But to those who had seen it, who had felt the shift, she was something more. Not because she had been elevated, not because she had been singled out, but because she had stood still when it would have been easier to fold, had spoken calmly when it would have been easier to stay silent, and had allowed the truth to carry itself without force. And in a room built on power, that kind of presence did not go unnoticed. It redefined it. The room had returned to its rhythm, but it was not the same rhythm as before. It was quieter beneath the surface, more aware, as if something invisible had shifted the way people occupied the space. Conversations resumed, but voices stayed lower, more measured. Even the laughter that rose from a corner table felt softer, like it carried a new awareness of what had just taken place. Naomi moved between tables with the same precision she always had, her steps light, her posture steady, her focus exact. But there was something different now in the way people looked at her. Not obvious, not exaggerated, subtle. A second longer of eye contact, a slight nod where there had once been none. Respect that did not announce itself, but settled quietly into the space between interactions. At table 14, a guest who had earlier avoided meeting her eyes now paused as she placed a glass of water down. "Thank you," he said, clearly directly. Naomi gave a small nod in return, her expression calm, unchanged, but she registered it. Not the words themselves, but the way they were given. Across the room, Brian stood near the service station, reviewing a tablet he had barely looked at since the moment had passed. His posture was upright again, but it lacked the sharpness it once carried. There was no edge in his movements now, no urgency to assert control. Instead, there was something slower, more deliberate, as if each action required thought where before it had been automatic. He glanced up once, catching sight of Naomi as she moved past another table, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. He did not look away immediately this time. He gave a small nod, not performative, not forced, just acknowledgement. And then he returned to his work. It was a small moment, easy to miss, but in a place like this, small moments were rarely insignificant. Near the entrance, Alexander stood with the host, speaking quietly, his tone even, his posture relaxed, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. But the host listened closely, nodding with careful attention, aware of the presence beside him. Alexander did not gesture broadly, did not draw attention to himself, but his words carried weight in the way they always did. Not because they were loud, but because they were precise. After a moment, he turned, his gaze moving across the dining room once more, not searching, not inspecting, just observing. His eyes passed over the tables, the guests, the staff, and then, briefly, they landed on Naomi again. She did not stop. She did not acknowledge the look directly, but she felt it, not as pressure, not as expectation, just recognition. And that was enough. The night continued, orders placed and delivered, glasses filled and cleared, conversations rising and falling like a steady tide. But beneath it all, something remained. A memory of the moment when everything had paused, when truth had stepped forward without raising its voice, when power had not been asserted but redefined. Naomi reached for another plate, her hands steady, her movements unchanged, but inside, she carried something new. Not pride, not victory, something quieter, certainty. She had not needed to prove who she was. She had simply needed the moment to reveal it. And now that it had, there was no need to hold on to it, no need to revisit it. Because dignity, once seen, did not need to be repeated. It stayed. The night moved forward, but it did not erase what had happened. It carried it, quietly, like a current beneath the surface that could not be seen, but could be felt in every interaction that followed. Naomi stepped into the service corridor for a brief moment, the soft swing of the door muting the sound of the dining room behind her. The fluorescent lights above were cooler, harsher, revealing the reality behind the polished front. Stainless steel counters, neatly stacked plates, the low hum of refrigeration units. This was the space where everything reset, where performance gave way to process. She set her tray down carefully, her hands steady, then placed both palms lightly against the edge of the counter. For a second, she closed her eyes. Not out of exhaustion, not out of relief, just a pause, a breath that belonged only to her. Moments like the one she had just walked through did not always leave room for feeling while they were happening. The weight came after, but even that weight felt different tonight. Not heavy, grounded. She opened her eyes again, straightened her posture, and reached for a fresh set of glasses. The rhythm returned immediately. Work did not wait for reflection. It never had. As she pushed the door open and stepped back into the dining room, the warmth of the space met her again, the glow of soft lighting, The quiet cadence of conversations, the steady motion of service continuing as if nothing had interrupted it. But something had, and the room knew it. At the far end, Alexander had taken a seat at a corner table, one that offered a clear view of the room without placing him at its center. He had not made an entrance earlier, and he was not making a statement now. He simply existed within the space, his presence no longer disruptive, but still influential in a way that could not be ignored. A server approached his table, offering water, speaking softly. He nodded, listening, his attention focused, as if every interaction deserved the same level of presence, regardless of who it involved. Naomi noticed it as she moved between tables. Not the fact that he had sat down, but how he carried himself once he had. No demand for attention. No expectation of priority. Just quiet awareness. It was subtle, but it stood out. At table 9, a guest gestured slightly as Naomi approached, his tone polite, his request clear. She responded with the same calm precision she always had, noting the order, confirming details, moving with efficiency that came from experience rather than pressure. The work had not changed, but the way it was received had, and that difference mattered. Near the service station, Brian adjusted the schedule on the tablet again, his movements measured, deliberate. He paused as Naomi passed, then spoke, his voice low, controlled. Table 9 will need follow-up in about 5 minutes, he said. The instruction was simple, professional, but this time, it was given without edge, without assumption. Naomi nodded once. Understood, she replied. And that was it. No tension, no correction, just coordination. It was a small exchange, but it marked something important. Not a complete change, not a transformation, but a shift in direction. And sometimes, that was where real change began. Across the room, Alexander lifted his glass slightly, not to call attention, but as a quiet signal. Naomi saw it, adjusted her path, and approached his table with the same steady composure she had carried all night. Good evening, she said calmly. How can I assist you? Alexander looked up, meeting her gaze directly, not as someone above her, not as someone evaluating her, but simply as someone acknowledging her presence. You already have, he replied. The words were soft, but clear. Naomi held his gaze for a brief moment, then gave a small nod, not out of uncertainty, but understanding. She did not ask for clarification. She did not need to, because some statements were not meant to be expanded. They were meant to be recognized. And in that moment, without spectacle, without announcement, something settled into place. Not just for her, for the room, for the people who had witnessed what happened, for the ones who had learned from it, even without speaking. The night continued, but it carried a different meaning now, one that would not fade when the lights dimmed and the doors closed. Because moments like this did not end when the shift did. They stayed. By the time the last course was served, the restaurant had softened into its closing rhythm, the kind that only comes after a long evening when everything that needed to happen has already happened. The lighting felt warmer, the conversation slower, the movements more deliberate. Glasses were cleared, chairs adjusted, quiet laughter rising and fading like a distant echo. But beneath that calm, something remained. Not tension, not discomfort, something steadier. A memory that had settled into the walls, into the way people moved, into the way they looked at one another. Naomi carried a final tray toward the service station, her steps as measured as they had been at the start of the night, her posture unchanged, her focus exact. If someone had walked in at that moment, they would have seen nothing unusual. Just another server finishing her shift. But the ones who had been there, the ones who had witnessed everything, saw something different. Not in what she did, but in how she did it. There was no rush in her movements. No need to prove anything. Just quiet certainty. At the far corner, Alexander finished his meal without drawing attention, setting his glass down with the same calm precision he had carried since the moment he arrived. He did not call anyone over immediately. He did not signal for recognition. He simply waited, allowing the natural rhythm of service to reach him. And it did. Naomi approached, just as she had before, her expression composed, her voice steady. Was everything satisfactory this evening? She asked. The question was routine, familiar, but tonight, it carried something more. Alexander looked up, meeting her gaze again, not as a guest to a server, not as a position to a role, but as one person acknowledging another. Yes, he said simply. Then, After a brief pause, he added, "Because of you." The words were quiet, but they did not need to be louder. Naomi gave a small nod, accepting them without hesitation, without surprise, as if she understood that recognition, when it is real, does not need to be exaggerated. She placed the check folder gently on the table, her movements smooth, then stepped back, giving him space without breaking the moment. Across the room, Brian stood near the entrance, speaking softly with another staff member, his tone even, his posture relaxed in a way that had not been present before. He paused as Alexander rose from his seat, straightening slightly, but not rushing forward. There was no need. The distance between them was no longer defined by authority, but by understanding. Alexander walked past him, slowing just enough to acknowledge his presence. "Good night," he said. Brian nodded. "Good night, sir." No tension, no performance, just clarity, the kind that lingers longer than any correction ever could. Near the exit, the doors opened quietly, the cool night air slipping in for just a second before closing again behind him. And just like that, the presence that had shifted the entire evening stepped back into the world outside, leaving something behind that could not be undone. Inside, the restaurant continued its closing routine. Lights dimmed slightly. Tables were reset. The final guests prepared to leave. Naomi returned to the service station, setting down her tray, her hands steady, her expression calm. One of the other servers glanced at her, then gave a small, genuine smile. Naomi returned it, just as simply. No words needed. Because some things do not need to be explained. They are understood. As she untied her apron at the end of the shift, folding it neatly the way she always did, she paused for just a moment, her fingers resting lightly against the fabric. Not to hold on to the night, not to replay it, but to acknowledge it. Then she placed the apron down, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward the exit with the same quiet confidence she had carried all along. She had not raised her voice. She had not demanded respect. She had not asked to be seen. And yet, by the end of the night, everything had changed. Not because power had been taken, but because dignity had been recognized. And once it is recognized, it does not disappear. It stays in the room, in the people, in the way the story is remembered long after the doors close.